with you, but why it is so difficult to say anything about it or to English it, because we're not used to that kind of perspective. So I think, the final failure of education in this country has been the de-emphasis of history and the production of generations of people who are total amnesiacs. They don't know what was going on in the 14th century or the 8th century BC. So essentially, they don't know who they are, because that is who you are. The psychedelic point of view of a person is to see a person as just a moving wavefront of genetic expression that is present in the here and now, and extends backward into time through the ancestors. There's something which is called the Tao of the ancestors, which is simply, for each one of us, the best way to do things. The best way to pick up a pencil, the best way to take a drink. And this is how the people who stand behind you have always done it. And so when you do it that way, it isn't like you doing it at all. It's as though all of those people act to do it. The morphogenetic field for that activity is so strong. I first noticed this when I took a course in shamanism, and one of the little projects that they wanted us to do was to chip flint and to make arrow points, which I had never done. And when I sat down and started to do it, 30 seconds into it, I realized, my God, this is what people are made for. This is what they've been doing for the past 3 million years, less 5,000. Everything else, keyboard punching, sculpting of Madonnas, mummy making, cathedral building, glyph carving, that's all peanuts compared to the amount of time we've been chipping stone. And you feel it in your hands. You have a memory of how to do this. And we may have many memories of how to do many things if we will but open ourselves up. We cannot go into the future with the luxury of an unconscious. The H-bomb ensures this. And so, you see, in a very weird way, the H-bomb is a catalyst for evolutionary advance. It's the final catalyst for evolutionary advance. It's like the breaking of the water in a birth. Once this happens, there's no going back. Once you have hydrogen fusion, you probably have 100 years maximum to figure it out, or you will be extinct. But it is not necessarily lethal. Its purpose is not to destroy us. Its purpose is to sober us up and push us forward to the next level. The energy release, the fascination with energy release that we've been exploring for the past several thousand years culminates in hallucinogenic drugs and massive release of energy on the atomic level. And we need to use these things to push ourselves forward. If it wasn't for the sobering effect of the presence of hydrogen bombs all over the planet, I'm not sure that the cultural debate on transformation would be taking place at all.
Do you think it's a coincidence that Hoffman took LSD in 1942 at the same time they were building the first atomic bomb?
No, I don't think there are coincidences. I think all this stuff is part of the plan. It's all led in. And I said, several years ago at Esalen, I said, what mushroom is it that grows at the end of human history? Is it the mushroom of Oppenheimer and Teller, or is it the mushroom of Hoffman and Wasson? Because it's definitely about transformation and release of energy into Thanatos or Eros. And these two possibilities loom directly in front of us. And I think, as I've heard John say, the universe loves you ruthlessly. It will watch and let you make this decision. Let us make this decision. And we can't know how rare a thing humanness is. We can't know how much hangs in the balance if we blow it. Certainly we have only the vaguest intimations that anything like what we have achieved has been achieved anywhere else. I think You know, the greatest glory of God is probably an act of human understanding. There's nothing that transcends the potential power of that, because somehow the fate of God is tied up in the human fate. I mean, a God without human beings is a fairly neutral kind of concept. We are, as I said, the catalytic agents of the cosmic drama. And I don't know to what degree we are monkeys, to what degree consciousness is a thing alien to the monkeys, and using primate organization simply as a foundation for itself. For instance, you know, in the 19th century, the great challenge to people's conception of what is human was the notion that we were descended from the apes, the sin of Darwin, and people just were appalled and could not write that into their script. I think the great challenge in the 20th century that is going to force people to rethink what is humanness is going to be the perfection of thinking machines. This will be the final humiliation of our privileged place in the cosmos. And yet, you know, we've gotten used to the idea that we're descended from primates, and I think we can get used to the idea that we can produce thinking machines. It will just be said, after all, they wouldn't be here if we hadn't made them. So, but that kind of thing raises a question as to what is consciousness, and to what degree is it dependent on organic or cybernetic organization? Can we go off into the private Idahos of our own heads? Is that what history is leading us toward? Is that what heaven is? That heaven is the realization of a historical state that is ruled over by the physics of the imagination rather than the inert physics of the creation of the demiurge, the physics of the inert material universe? I think probably it is. You know, Plato said if God didn't exist, man would invent it, him, her. If paradise doesn't exist, we will probably create it, and hell as well. Certainly history is a series of pendulum shifts from heavens to hells, always with the idea that one justifies the other. But in our heads, we contact these realities that are not the privilege of yogins or mystics or people who spend years and years in monasteries. They're the privilege of any human being courageous enough to seek them. And I think that is a tremendous carrot to historical evolution. It means that each one of us is an agent of this thing. You don't have to think of yourself as a cog in a large machine. In fact, that whole notion of cogs and machines can give way to the notion of a solid state set of equally potentiated oscillators, each one of which may send out a signal that the other oscillators will fall into resonance with. And it has to do with the creation of a commonality of language and a common understanding about these things, and an effort to talk ever more clearly about the content of the experience without referencing it back to everything that has been tabooed, without thinking of it as, the province of mystics or the province of psychopathy. It is, in fact, the unclaimed part of ourselves, in the same way that, sexuality has been claimed as a part of ourselves. I mean, there have been very few eras in human history where sexuality was fully explored and realized. And where this did happen, they tended to be ancillary to the main forward thrust of historical civilization. It's only since Freud, really, that a global civilization cognizant of sexuality has emerged. Following upon that, and maybe even consequent upon that, is realizing that the most erotic organ of the body is the mind. And coupling that with the concept of psychedelic drugs lays open the possibility for a truly humane society based essentially on eros. And this is the millennium that everyone is talking about. This is the possibility of actually shedding the freight of the historical experience and existing in a kind of elysium of consciousness that is the fruits of having come through the crisis in the biosphere that the emergence of consciousness represents. Because consciousness will generate ideas, and these ideas will and are carrying us off the planet, out into space, deeper into ourselves, deeper into interface with cybernetic matrices, deeper into an understanding of the mechanics of the planet and our place in it. And all of the cultural concerns of the last 500 years are essentially coming to a culmination and will be replaced, we hope, with a different set of considerations. I remember when I was a child, I often heard the saying, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. And I think the politics of the millennium are all tied up in that. We must make wishes horses so that beggars do ride, and then every beggar will have a horse, and society will be much better off for it. I see human history as a psychedelic experience that is accessible to everyone. If you study it, if you look back through it, if you get so you can feel it, then it's all there, all those people, all that blood, all that treasure, all those hopes and love affairs and betrayals and disappointments are somehow for us, were for us, and these people are living in us in the expectation of our completing this project so long in the making. In other words, of our completing the tale. And Scylla Simon shows you that movie. It shows you history. I mean, when I take it, I invoke it, and I say, show the old things, show the elder possibilities. And it always carries me back, to this place, the Caspian Sea, 9,000 to 15,000 years ago. The rugs, the weaving, the horsehair, the polished brass, the fermented mare's milk, all of this stuff. That's where it began. It's when these psychedelic-using tribes encountered the mountain ranges of Central Asia that presented such a barrier that the pressure out of that contact, I think, emerged consciousness, or consciousness finally took hold like a flame on the human species and has not relinquished its presence ever since. And yet, the mushroom says this is an opportunity. It will not last forever. If consciousness is not transformed again and again into higher and higher states of itself, it can fall victim to the lower Darwinian mechanics that operate on the planet. In other words, we can be found to be not a glorious exemplification of the laws of the universe, but a lethal and destructive force. And in that case, we will be eliminated, and the planet will return to the gentle cycle of the seasons and the millennia that were what life on this planet was until 1 million years ago. We are some kind of grand roll of the dice, some kind of almost God's vision of his own salvation through the notion of human beings. And the way in which these insights are going to be recovered is through psychedelics, not through ideology, because ideology is too confining. Somebody always wants to tell you how you should be, and only direct experience of the mystery is really valid. This is why we need to create a shamanic class of people who are pointing out toward the future with a knowledge of the past and bringing it into being.
Be here now. Just be here now.
Thank you for joining us for the Alan Watts podcast, Being in the Way. I'm your host, Mark Watts. And today we're going to go back to the origins of this podcast and rejoin the Ram Dass Be Here Now podcast network for a special program that's a mix of Ram Dass and my father, Alan Watts. And it's about the Bhagavad Gita. And first we're going to hear from Ram Dass, a course that he did at the Naropa Institute in Boulder, where he's going to talk about his own experience with the Bhagavad Gita and the different stories and perspectives within it and how he read each of those. It's really interesting commentary, gives you a very user-friendly introduction to this text. Then we're going to go on to a radio program that my father did as part of the Great Books of Asia. This was in the mid-50s. It was broadcast from KPFA in Berkeley, and it's a really interesting talk. He not only gets into the history and some of the background of the Gita, but he also takes it to its sort of logical conclusion on how this can impact motivation and action. And he also describes a form of yoga, which I have heard him talk about elsewhere as intellectual yoga. But here it's more specifically in the context of what we would call karma, or your doing. This comes about 20 minutes into his presentation, and I think you'll find it very interesting. So today it's the Bhagavad Gita. We're going to start off with Ram Dass, and then we're going to go to my father. This podcast is made in cooperation with the Ram Dass Be Here Now podcast network and was made possible by a grant from the Rizzuto Foundation. Our theme music is by Zakir Hussain, courtesy of Moment Records, and it's from his Rhythm Experience album. And now here's Alan Watts and Ram Dass from the Bhagavad Gita.
I'd like to introduce you to a course entitled The Yogas of the Bhagavad Gita. This course has been given at the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado, which is an institute that was founded by Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, a Tibetan Buddhist meditation master. And I was invited to come here and teach a course during the first session. The reason I've chosen to teach the Bhagavad Gita, first because it represents, in the most general sense, a tradition that I have been steeped in for some years, namely the Hindu tradition. But equally relevant because it concerns a form of discipline or yoga or method that is very suitable to our predicament in the West at this moment. I should say at the outset, the spirit or the rules of the game about teaching a course and even calling it the Bhagavad Gita, this course is more concerned with a commentary about certain points in the Bhagavad Gita as they relate to our daily lives. The Gita, as I understand it, is a way of making one's entire life a vehicle for becoming conscious or coming into the spirit or coming to God, whatever metaphor you would particularly feel comfortable working with. I think we might consider a moment the issue of figure and ground. When we relate to one another, we relate around forms, and we are talking about concepts and the Bhagavad Gita and ideas. But that is merely the vehicle. That's the stuff through which you and I are relating. And if we keep in mind that the transmission is meta-conceptual, the transmission is a transmission of feeling, it's a transmission of being. That is, all I really understand by teaching that one can share is one's being. You can't, that if I talk about love, but I'm full of hate, you won't experience the love. And it won't do you much good. You'll just end up with a lot of dead butterflies to add to your collection. On the other hand, whatever it is that I've evolved into, whatever words I use, you will experience a transmission of being from one person to another, and that will be useful to you or not, as your heart dictates. So I can understand quite clearly that the work I can do to make this course productive is to remain as conscious and as open as I can be as a being, because I understand this work as the work on myself. This is an exercise in my own consciousness, teaching this course. I'm not a fully realized being. I'm somebody working on myself, just as I assume you are. And we are coming together to, on the path, to meet, to recognize one another, and to share maps, and to realize that the maps are part of it, but behind the maps, here we are. The Gita is very simply a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. And Krishna is a form of God, an avataric form of God. And we'll talk more later about what all that means. And Arjuna is a very pure warrior. He's a very straight, solid being, a very good person. And this is a dialogue on a battlefield. And in a moment, I'd like to tell you about what that battlefield is from a historical point of view. At a symbolic level, what the Gita is a dialogue between God and the seeker. And the battlefield turns out to be the inner battlefield, the battlefield of our own evolutionary being. So I have suggested to students, and I've certainly done it myself, that you read the Gita a number of times. It's a very small book. It can be read in a matter of a few hours. It can't be understood in a matter of a few hours, but it can be read in a matter of a few hours. But it's kind of fun to read it from different angles. You read it first as a fascinating story of a sort of a melodrama of will Krishna fight, will Arjuna fight, or won't he, and will Krishna convince him, and that kind of, and the unfairness of it all, and you go through all the social, political issues inside yourself about it. Then it's very useful to read the Gita from the point of view of identifying with Arjuna. That is, experiencing, once you have appreciated that the conflict is not unique to a historical period and to a few people, but rather is a conflict that's in each of us. And that the reason that you're even attracted to watching this at this moment is because of the relevance of the conflict inside you, the relevance of the conflict inside yourself. Then you read it as Arjuna with God talking to you. And as if your inner voice, the inner, what the Quakers call the still small voice within, is speaking to you. And you're just open to the way that you're being guided or instructed. The inner guru within is guiding you. The third reading is even farther out, and this is very, very difficult for those of us that have grown up in Western religious traditions, because the third reading is to read it as if you're Krishna, speaking to Arjuna. That means now you're being asked to identify with God. And that merging of the seeker and that which is sought, the merging of the beloved and the lover, the merging of the devotee and the guru, those two things coming together, is very